I decided to make a takedown laminated recurve crossbow to use the steel trigger assembly from my previous video. After messing about with some prototypes, this is what I came up with. The bow limbs are made from 4 flitches of 18-inch long, 2-inch by 1/8-inch hickory. To make the recurve form, I screwed down the clamp blocks to the bench and then adjusted the bend until everything felt and looked right. The flitches were glued up with Titebond 3 glue and everything was clamped and left for 24 hours. I used the same form for both the right and the left limbs. After some cleanup with a hand plane, I took a pass on the joiner and the table saw to get 2 straight and identical limbs. The bow taper was then laid out, leaving 3 inches for the clamp with a 3/4 inch tip, and then cut on the bandsaw and cleaned up with a hand plane sander. Bow tips were made from black walnut and glued to the limbs using Titebond 3 glue. I then laid out the bowline groove and then cut the grooves with a triangle file. The final shaping was then done with flat and half-round files. Notice that the last 6 inches of the bow limb have been thinned down from 4 flitches to 3 to get a more even bend in the bow. Finally, the string groove was deepened and refined using a small round file and then hand sanded to a nice polish. The stock was cut from a 1-inch by 3-inch hickory blank on the bandsaw. The mortise for the steel trigger was then laid out and cut. I used the mounting holes on the trigger case to locate the mounting holes in the stock. It's a large chisel and files to cut the chamfer and then round it over to make the final profile. Each step in the round over should be done on all sides before proceeding to the next step to ensure a symmetrical shape. Turning a blocky shape into a comfortable, organically shaped handle is one of my favorite parts of this project. Final sanding is done mostly by hand because the complex shapes make using a palm sander impractical. Since this is a takedown bow, it requires a clamp to hold the limbs in place. The clamp is made from 2 pieces of 5/8-inch hickory, 2 inches wide and 6 inches long. Small lip is milled into the back clamp to help locate the limbs during assembly. Because I want the bowstring to pass above the stock and the bolt's path to be as straight as possible, a bolt notch is milled into the top of the clamp and the limbs. This also makes all the parts visually easier to identify as left and right so that the bow isn't accidentally assembled upside down or backwards. After some sanding and fitting, 1/4 inch mounting bolts are laid out and drilled into the clamp blocks and bow limbs. Finally, the belt sander is used to mill an arch into the front clamp. This puts pressure onto the center tips of the bow limbs and makes the clamp much stronger. The front clamp is then rounded over for looks and to make the inside and outside of the clamp visually obvious. I didn't do a full tailoring job on this bow, but it felt mostly right. It feels like maybe a 50-pound draw, but I didn't measure it or test it with a full bend. I used some pine to mock up a template for the brace, then transferred the layout to 2-inch by 1.5-inch, 6-inch long blocks. Blocks are then cut out in the bandsaw and the 2 clamped together and sanded to match on the belt sander. Using the same techniques as done on the stock, the braces are rounded over and shaped to match. Mounting holes are pre-drilled and countersunk into the clamp and the braces, and after some test fitting, the braces are countersunk and drilled for 1/4 inch by 2.5 inch mounting bolts to the stock. The bowstring is 1/16 inch wire rope. The loops were fixed in place using some crimped on metal hardware, but it will need adjustment after a few test shots to accommodate for stretching of the wire. I added this bolt holder made out of some hammered sheet metal, and I've opened up the width of this gaff a bit to make room for the fletching on the arrows. So let's see how it shoots.